Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I'm going to go over an image of the Soul Nebula. This is data that I captured a while ago, so today, what I'm going to work on today is some new data, so hopefully it'll wind up looking something like this. And we're going to do that in PixInsight and Photoshop. So let's start in PixInsight. And this is data that I captured last night, and we're approaching a full moon, about 2 days away from a full moon, I think. So it's not the greatest data, and I only have a few hours of RGB plus narrowband SHO data, but we'll work with what we have and see what we get out of it. So to start with, I've already run all of this data through WBPP, and that created the master files for red, green, blue, sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. These were captured with a monochrome camera. So I'll just open all 6 of those. And this is kind of my usual process through PixInsight. I'll process the red, green, and blue into one composite RGB image, process each one of the SHO files separately, and then separate out the stars. So when I get done, we'll save the RGB color image starless. We'll save the RGB stars, and then we'll save the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen, each one as an individual file. So to start with, and I'm going to be working from these saved process icons over on the right. I'm going to start by opening up the screen transfer function so I can get a glimpse at what we've got here. That's the sulfur, and that looks reasonably good. There's going to be some gradients, mostly caused by the full moon, so it's not ideal data. First thing I want to do is combine my red, green, and blue. So I'm going to open up the channel combination tool, and we can just grab the red from the name tab over on the left and drag that into the field for the red. Green goes into green, blue goes into blue, and click on the solid circle, and that'll create our RGB image. And now that we have that, I can just discard the individual red, green, and blue, and we're going to work with just these 4 images. And I'm going to do pretty much the same processing on all of the images, so it's useful to work with a image container. And an image container is just a shortcut way of stacking up the images that you want to do the same process to. So I'll just right click here on the background and choose image container, and from this icon I can choose to add views. There are the 4 views that are open, and so I'll just select all, click OK, and now we have these 4 files listed in this beginnings of an image container. Now, if I want to run, which I do, I want to run Graxpert on each one of these, I can just take the triangle from the image container window, drag it up, and drop it on my Graxpert process icon, and PixInsight will go through and run Graxpert on each one of those 4 files, one after the other. It doesn't make it run any faster, but it lets the computer do some work while I'm free to talk to you or check my email or go get a cup of coffee. So it kind of frees up my time while the computer's working on its thing. And as soon as this is done, we'll see what we have. If there's any registration edge artifacts, sometimes you have to do a dynamic crop and crop each one of the images before running Graxpert. I find sometimes Graxpert is a little bit too aggressive. Looks like it did okay with this data. So now for a minute I'm going to focus on just the color image. First I want to run Blur Exterminator in correct only mode, and that's right here in my list of process icons. And you notice I'm just more or less working from the top down. So I've got my screen transfer function, channel combination, gradient correction tools up top. Next is Blur Exterminator in correct only mode. Following that is the spectrophotometric color calibration. configured for each one of my systems. So there's one for the one-shot color camera, one for the mono camera, one for the mono camera on the Dream Scope. In this FLI 16803 I'm not currently using, but I do still have some old data, so I still keep it in the list. So this is done. We can now run spectrophotometric color calibration. So I just grab the one for the correct system, drag it onto the image, and this will run our color calibration. And once we're done with the color calibration, then we're going to go back to running Blur Exterminator on all 4 of the images. Then we'll stretch each image, apply Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator, save the files, and then we'll be ready to work in Photoshop. So looks like the color calibration is just about done. Finishing up, neutralizing the background, and there it is. So now I want to be sure I have the link clicked so that I'm doing a linked stretch with the screen transfer function. And we'll update that to see how it looks. And that looks good. So now I want to run all 4 of these files through Blur Exterminator. So again, I'm going to grab the triangle from this image container, drag it up to Blur Exterminator, and we'll just let it run through all 4 files. That'll take about 2 minutes, so I'm going to pause the video while that runs. Blur Exterminator is done now, and I took advantage of the break to go downstairs and get a fresh drink of water. So we've run Blur Exterminator on all 4 of these images. Now we're ready to stretch them, and I'm going to do that just using the screen transfer function. I really do the fine-tuning of the stretch in Photoshop, so the goal here is just to get a good representative range of tones with nothing, none of the darks blocked up or none of the highlights blown out. So I'm going to open the histogram transformation tool, and if you're familiar with doing this, that's how you apply a screen transfer stretch. So we'll start with the color image and click the radioactive button to make sure we have a current view of it. And I find I usually need to fine-tune the stretch a little bit. So the more easy way to do it, or the right way to do it, would be to use the little plus and minus zoom tools. And that lets you zoom in on the sliders. So if I center the plus tool and click, that's zooming in, and we're kind of zooming in on those sliders because they're actually very close together at the dark end. Now that I can see the black slider and the midpoint slider well, I can go back to my arrow tool and I can fine tune. Usually I darken the blacks a little bit and brighten the midtones a little bit, so I'm making this a little bit more aggressive on the stretch. It kind of depends on the image. And then to apply that, we'll just drag the triangle down to the histogram transformation tool bottom bar, click the solid square to apply it, and the image will turn white because now we're applying the screen stretch to an image that has actually been stretched. So I'll turn off the stretch, and we'll go to the next one, which is the sulfur, and we'll go through the same process. You can also use the scroll wheel on the mouse to zoom in and out, and that usually works a little bit faster than going back and forth between the plus and minus zoom tools. So there's the sulfur. Now we'll do the oxygen and just do a quick adjustment, bring out a little bit more. And once you start doing this kind of differential or independent stretching of each image, you've really pretty much eliminated what a lot of people say is the scientific value of the image, because you no longer have representative comparable values that you can compare between the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it makes a much nicer image, but you lose some of the scientific meaning, if you will. I'm after a pretty picture rather than a science image, so that doesn't bother me. I'll turn off the screen stretch on each one of these so I know where I'm at. And now we have all 4 images stretched. We're done with the histogram transformation. Now I want to apply noise and star exterminator, and again I have a saved process icon. In this case it's a process container that actually does both noise exterminator and then star exterminator, and I'll apply that to all 4 of these images. So I'll just again drag the triangle over to the process container and we'll let that run for a couple minutes. Okay, so Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator have done their thing, and we're done now with these process containers. This is the RGB Stars, and I usually run a little process container that I call Enhanced Stars. And what it does, I can show you the details, it runs 3 things. It does a curves transformation, which increases saturation, and then it does an SCNR to reduce green, and then one to reduce red. And I do the red because I find that the red stars tend to become too red when you start putting them over an SHO image that has a lot of red in it. So usually it helps to knock some of that red out. So I've applied that, and now we'll just save this as a 16-bit TIFF. So I'm just going to go to my Dreamscope data. There's the Soul Nebula. Save it as a 16-bit TIFF. And I don't need to change the name because I know by the folder that it's in what the image is. And I don't think I'm going to do anything with the narrowband stars. Sometimes you have narrowband stars that are just such nice stars. You want to use them to for the shapes of the stars. In this case, I don't think I'm going to do anything with them. So here's our, let's go to the RGB next. So this is the RGB image, and we'll save this. I don't know if we'll use it for anything, but we'll save this also as a 16-bit TIFF. And lastly, we need to save each one of the narrowband images. This is the sulfur. So save as, and with these, we have to navigate to the folder that we want and specify 16-bit TIFF. And just quickly do the same thing with each one of the others. Let's see, Dreamscope. The way PixInsight works, if you are saving an image that was created in PixInsight, such as the red, green, and blue, then it will default to the last save folder. If you're saving an image that you opened from a drive, such as the narrowband images, it'll default to saving it back where it came from. So that's why with the narrowband images I need to navigate to the folder where I want to save them, because it's different than the folder I opened that file from. Specify 16-bit TIFF. So these are all done, and now we're ready to go to Photoshop. And in Photoshop, I always start with File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that brings up this dialog box where you can browse for the list of files that you want to open, which in this case is the Soul Nebula and these 5 files. Click OK again, and now it will open each one of those files as a layer in Photoshop. And the next step is to put each one of these images in its own layer group and start applying the color mapping. And I'm going to show you, first of all, I'm going to show you the way I do it. I organize the stars on top, and then hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and then I use an action that I recorded that does everything for me. So with that, I now have my SHO image already the basic organization done, so that each one of the individual files is in a folder. I have a folder of global adjustments. The stars are on top. So if I can find a good way to make this action available, I will. So far I don't have a good way to do that, so let's go back and do everything the hard way. And it looks like we'll have to just start over. So I'm just going to close this image. I didn't save anything, and we'll just start over with scripts, load files into stack, browse for the 5 files that we want, click OK again, and these will open as individual layers. And the first thing I like to do is organize everything into folders. And the reason for doing that is you can think of what happens in the folder stays in the folder. So I'll just grab these files, or these layers, one by one. I'll start with the stars, drag it up to the top because that's where it's going to land. Control G to put that into a group. Change the group name to stars. And we're going to put this in screen blending mode. And I know I'm going to add a couple of adjustment layers, so I'll just go ahead and click on the layer itself inside the group, and I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer and a hue saturation. And then I'll close the group, turn it off, go to the next one is hydrogen. So Control G, label hydrogen, and I know I want to add a few layers in here. Most of the time I add a blank layer in soft light blending mode, and that just lets me do local brightening and darkening if I need to. Next we'll add a levels adjustment layer. We'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and the hue saturation adjustment layer I'm going to very specifically put in colorized mode, I should say. And I want the lightness to be -50. Saturation 100%, and since this is hydrogen and this is going to be SHO, we want it to be green, so that's a hue of 130. That's our green. Now we'll just turn this off. We'll do the same thing with oxygen. Control G, label this oxygen, and just to save time, these layers are the same. So I'm just going to grab the blank layer in soft light blending mode, the levels and the hue saturation, Control J to copy those or jump them to a new layer is the way people sometimes remember that, and then just drag these down on top of the oxygen, and we'll change the color of the oxygen to 240, which is blue. And last we'll do the sulfur. Control G, change the name to sulfur. And again, I'm just going to grab a copy of these 4 layers, drag them down into the sulfur, and we'll just change the color to red. And then at the bottom is the RGB, and I'm going to put it into a group, label it RGB, and I will probably put the same set of layers in there as well. Press the wrong keyboard and I see I've got another problem I need to fix. So for right now I'm just going to turn off that, well, I'll just reset the hue saturation. So there's our RGB group. I don't know if you noticed, but in the process of copying and moving, I actually made a copy and moved this hydrogen image layer down. So we've got an extra hydrogen layer. I'm just going to delete that. I just deleted too many layers, or copied too many layers, I should say. So now if we turn on our narrowband layers, we've got hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, but you can only see whatever layer group is on top. And so we need to change the blending mode, like we did with stars. We'll change the blending mode for these layer groups from pass-through, which is the default for a layer group, to screen. And it looks like I may have to do these one at a time because we don't want to change the blending mode of everything in the group. So there's our sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. Each of the layer groups is in screen blending mode. And within each layer group, we have the pixel data, a retouching layer, a levels adjustment layer, and then the hue saturation. And it's this hue saturation that gives each filter its color. So the next step is going to be to fine-tune the brightness of each one of these. And I guess I just kind of know from experience that looking at the image, looking at the histogram, I can see I need to darken the darks by sliding this slider into the right. And then I'll probably brighten the highlights. And I think I'll add a little bit more in the midtones, get a little bit more red around the perimeter. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll look at our oxygen. And again, we need to darken the background, brighten the midtones, maybe brighten the highlights a little bit. And let's look at our hydrogen, same thing, darken the background, brighten the midtones a little bit. And now I'm just starting to look at the resulting color. The red around this perimeter is a little bit magenta, so that means I need to take out some blue. Blue is in the oxygen, so I'm going to darken the oxygen blacks a little bit and maybe brighten the midtones here in the red. Actually, it probably looks better like that. Now it's just a matter of iteratively going through the different layers and fine-tuning the brightness, which determines the contribution of each one of the layers. And I'm going to stick with something like that for now. That gives us a nice blue in the center. We've got some red around the perimeter, a lot of yellow where we have both the green from hydrogen and the red from sulfur. And now we'll see what happens if we turn on the RGB. Sometimes this adds, even though it's gets a little bright initially, let's close each one of the RGB or narrowband layers. Let's turn the RGB on and off. So what the RGB is doing is filling in just some of the values. Each one of these three is in screen blending mode. The RGB is a little, makes it too bright, but we can tone it down just by darkening I think something like that gives it a nice touch. So we actually have an RGB base, which is pretty dark, but then we're adding narrowband sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen on top of that in screen blending mode. Now we'll go above the hydrogen and below the stars, and we'll add some global adjustments. And I always use pretty much the same pattern. I'm going to have a levels adjustment layer. I'll have a blank layer in soft light blending mode in case I want to do any local brightening and darkening, a color balance, and then a hue saturation. And then the last layer I'm going to add here is going to be a solid color, and I'll get to that by using this, looks like a yin-yang symbol at the bottom of the layers palette. I'll choose solid color, and I want it to be RGB values of 19, 19, 19. And that happens to be the equivalent of hex values of 13, 13, 13, which you can just type into the hex field. Click OK, and we'll put this in lighten blending mode. And what that does is it just creates a minimum darkness. Nothing will be darker than 19, 19, 19. And lastly, I'll just grab all of these layers I just created, throw them into a group, and we'll call it global adjustments. And from our global adjustments, I think I'll darken, looks like I'll darken the darks a little bit. Maybe bring up the midtones slightly. Let's play with the color balance a little bit. A little bit of red seems nice. A little magenta. And some of this could be done with the individual color layers, but I think you reach a point where it's easier just to make some global adjustments. Saturation is probably pretty good as it is, I might target the yellows and see if I want them to be more orange or more green. I think a little bit more on the orange side. And I might target the magentas and make them a little bit more red. And I might target the reds and make them a little more red also. Say something like that. I'm still, I think we've got a lot of radiance still in the oxygen. So I'm going to come down to the oxygen, which is where all this blue is coming from around the perimeter. And I'm going to use this burn and dodge layer to add a little bit of darkness or darken the hydrogen, which will take away some of that blue. So I'm going to use my brush tool. I'll tap B to get to the brush tool. And I want 10% opacity, so I can tap the 1 key, and that'll set the opacity to 10%. I want my default colors, so I'll tap the D key for default colors. And I can use the left and right bracket keys to make that bigger or smaller. And to start with, I'll just go around the perimeter with 10% opacity. And I'll add another stroke up here, another stroke down here. And all I'm doing is knocking out some of that blue that's showing up around the perimeter. And if I want to intensify the blue in the center, I could actually switch to white and add a little bit of blue in the center. Now, white is painting white, add blue. Well, what we're doing is brightening the oxygen, and the oxygen is color mapped as blue. So if I make the oxygen brighter, that adds more blue. There's a fair amount of green showing over here, and I don't mind that at all, because if I take away the 3 colors, if you only have 2 colors, you have a very kind of dull looking image. It would have just red and blue if you don't have any green component. So a little bit of green doesn't really bother me at all. Sometimes darkening the hydrogen will improve that a little bit, but I still want to keep the full range of colors. So let's turn on the stars and see what it looks like. Well, the stars kind of obliterate everything, and at least to my eye, there's just way too many stars. So to deal with that, let's start by just closing these groups. I'm going to go to my stars layer group, target the stars layer itself, and I'm going to convert it to a smart object so that I can apply some filters. And the reason I convert it to a smart object is so that the filters will apply as smart filters so that they're non-destructive. So to start with, I'm going to add noise, dust, and scratches, and a radius of about 5 pixels. And what that's going to do is knock out the little stars. If I turn that filter on and off, you can see the effect that it has. Now, in order to bring back some of the sharpness, I'm going to do a Smart Sharpen adjustment layer, and we'll apply that. And the settings were already at an appropriate spot, but because these are smart filters, I can always just double click on any one of the filters and change the settings. Now I'm going to go to the levels adjustment, and I'm going to knock those little stars out even more and kind of knock down the background so it looks something like that. I turn that off and on. You can see that might be a little too much. And we'll go to the hue saturation. Generally, I like to add quite a bit of color saturation to the stars, and sometimes you need to take out more of the red saturation. This actually looks okay. I'm going to come back to my global adjustments one last time and maybe darken it just a little bit, get a little bit more presence. Maybe brighten the brights just slightly. And that's a pretty good place to end. The next things I would do typically would be go through each one of the layers and add sharpening and sometimes high pass, which adds local contrast. We'll do that just on the hydrogen, just for the example. So I'll go to the hydrogen layer, and like we did with the stars, right click, convert to smart object. And the first filter I'm going to apply here is going to be the Smart Sharpen. And Smart Sharpen, the Smart in Smart Sharpen has nothing to do with this being a smart object. That's just the name of that sharpening filter. This is going to add some sharpness. And then the next thing I want to do is add some local contrast. This is a multi-step process. So first I'm going to use the high pass filter. And we'll have to come back and adjust it. So that applied the high pass filter. Now I can double click out here on the adjustment icons on the far right of that filter, and that'll bring up the filter's blending options. And just like we did with some of the others, we want to change the blending mode, and we want to change the blending mode from normal to soft light. Now I can double click on this high pass smart filter, and we can adjust the filter settings to find a value that looks like it works the best. And what this is doing is creating halos, and the halos create local contrast. And every image likes a little bit different spot. I think right in there looks pretty good. So I could do the same thing with the oxygen and sulfur, but I think I'll stop here just to keep this video from getting too long. So that's the basic process. We processed it in PixInsight, created the 5 files that we used here. Each one of those got placed into its own layer group. So when we get done, we have a layer group for RGB, sulfur, oxygen, hydrogen, global adjustments, and then the stars on top. And then the last thing I'll do is go to File, Save As, and I want to save this in my 2024 Photos folder, which looks like I'll have to navigate to get to. It's going to be under Photos, there we go, 2024 Photos, and I want to save this as a large document format, and this is going to be the Soul Nebula for video. And by saving it as a large document format, that saves all of these layers and layer groups and settings, everything just as we have it here intact. So I could come back to it later today, tomorrow, next week, next year, reopen this file in Photoshop and change any one of the things I've done. I haven't changed anything that I can't undo or redo later. And the real value of this non-destructive workflow is that you don't have to anticipate what it's going to look like 5 steps down the road. You've got all those steps laid out for you here, and I can change the combination or the contribution of any one of these layers and see how it affects the finished image on the fly in real time. So that is an extremely powerful method of editing. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. If you have any questions about remote hosting, be sure to get in touch with us at utahdesertremote.com. If you're interested in an hourly rental, we do rent time on our telescopes. So if you want this data for your own, get in touch with us and we'll set up a session to capture this data specifically for you. And with that, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.